Welcome back, folks. Last time we saw how Hernan Cortes came to Mexico with his expedition, got rid of his ships, defied the orders of Governor Velazquez, and even fell in love with La Malinche, who didn't even speak his language. Today we're going to find out what will happen. Will he find the Aztecs? Will he get the treasure? Will he get in trouble? Will his love be true? Find out today in Social Studies.
He looked down into her brown eyes and said, "Say a prayer for me." She threw her arms around him, whispered, "God will keep us free." They could hear the riders coming. He said, "This is my last fight. If they take me back to Texas, they won't take me back alive." No. There were 7 Spanish angels at the altar of the sun. They were praying for a lover in the valley of the gun. When the bell stopped and the smoke cleared, there was thunder from the throne. And 7 Spanish angels took another angel home.
Okay, the sounds of Ray Charles singing 7 Spanish Angels. Willie Nelson appears later in that song. We'll hear from him actually later on in our second part to this lesson, where we look at the aftermath of the conquest. So we see this lovely portrait here of the Spanish and the Aztecs having their final battle on the causeways of Tenochtitlan. We can see, we looked at the Renaissance art way back in our first unit, and we can see some early use of perspective with these ships and the horses in the background. Clearly they haven't quite got the hang of it, but it's coming along there. Okay, now Cortes had some problems. But first, before they was to catch up with him, he did reach Tenochtitlan in November of 1519, so a little over 500 years ago. And the emperor, Montezuma II, he was concerned, he was suspicious, and the Spanish seemed very interested in gold. Remember that he had these interpreters. With La Malinche, she could speak Nahuatl, and that Spanish priest could speak her language there. So between that, Cortes was able to communicate with the Aztecs. So he was hoping, Montezuma was, that this gold would keep him happy. But Montezuma was following the standard conquistador procedures, and he kept Montezuma hostage and decided to rule Tenochtitlan through him. Not very nice of him, was it? But remember that Cortes had irritated Governor Velazquez. Governor Velazquez didn't want to be one-upped. He wanted to be the greatest conquistador of all time. And if Cortes could take over Mexico, this would make Cuba seem like small potatoes. So Velazquez sent an army after Cortes. So a few months later, Cortes realized, I need to fight Velazquez. So he took most of his forces back to fight him. Meanwhile, he left behind his lieutenant, his right-hand man, Pedro de Alvarado. Some of you may have even picked Pedro de Alvarado in your Exploring Explorers project back in the fall. So this is very mysterious. I've tried to find more information about why Pedro de Alvarado acted the way he did. But anyway, he allowed this Aztec religious festival, and then, as it was taking place, he slaughtered the participants. Why do you think this was? Do you think he just was a really sick, nutty kind of guy? Or do you think the Aztecs then did something, or he didn't expect them to have certain procedures in their festivals? We might never know. But as you can imagine, usually when you get slaughtered, you're not too happy about it. So the Aztecs rebelled, just like you and I would. That's right, Pedro, you made a big, big oopsie. Nice tights, though. Okay. So during this rebellion, Montezuma was killed. And to this day, there's still debate about whether it was his own people who hated him for basically betraying them to the Spanish and giving in to their demands, or was he killed by the Spanish who just loved killing people? We'll never know. Well, maybe we will. Maybe that's your destiny, to be an archaeologist and find out. So Cortez, you might think he was the underdog, but he was a plucky fellow and he defeated Velazquez and then returned to Tenochtitlan. But when he got there, the city was in chaos. So he had to flee, he had to run away from the madness and abandon his treasure that he had stored there. So it looks like, hey, the conquest has failed. The Aztecs have won. Or have they? And there's a robot chicken depiction of the death of Montezuma. Now, it's a very common phenomenon. People who go to Mexico will get food poisoning, and that's known as Montezuma's revenge. Okay, the final battle. So yeah, it's a somewhat disturbing image there on the right. So Cortez, he returned the next year with more Spaniards, more Spanish soldiers. They knew this was worth investing a little bit more in, and a lot of native allies. Remember that a lot of these natives around the Aztecs who were getting pushed around by them and forced to give tributes and human sacrifices were all too willing to help the Spanish topple the Aztecs. So they were ready for a big showdown. When they got there, half of Tenochtitlan had died of smallpox. So just those few months of interaction with the Spanish and their horses was enough to spread disease and wipe out the population in a very short time. So really the smallpox made COVID look like small potatoes. And I realize it's the second time I've used small potatoes in this presentation, but they're my passion. What can I say? So that didn't mean that the Aztecs didn't have fighting spirit left. They held on for 80 days. By the end of this siege, Tenochtitlan was burned to the ground. And so over 100,000 Aztecs were killed, 500 Spanish, quite a few by their standards. Remember that it was just 300 men alone were able to take Cuba, and 20,000 of their native allies killed. So actually most of the people fighting against the Aztecs were actually other natives who were fighting back. So during the siege, the Aztecs kept on having their religious ceremonies. They continued doing human sacrifices. They believed that the gods would help them. But apparently not so much. Those bloodthirsty gods, just when you need them, they're not there for you. It's a real bummer. So we're going to find out in our next slide what will happen to Tenochtitlan after this. If you need a break, go drink some water, go eat some vegetables or some fruit, or dig up some roots and berries from your backyard. But I'll see you in a moment.
Living on the road, my friend, is gonna keep you free and clean. Now you wear your skin like iron, and your breath as hard as kerosene. Weren't your mama's only boy, her favorite one it seemed? She began to cry when you said goodbye. Sang to your dream.
Okay, it's Willie Nelson, the Ballad of Poncho and Lefty. Now, Merle Haggard sings later in that too, but once again, the other member of the duet is not there. Now, who is this elderly gentleman dancing away to the music in the Mexican desert? Well, you may not believe it, because we first met him when he was a fresh-faced youth, but this is Hernan Cortes. What will happen to make him so old and gray? Well, we'll find out. So what happened after this conquest? Well, you might remember that the Aztecs were sacrificing and being loyal to their gods, but they felt abandoned by them and destroyed their temples. They gave up on their faith. And not long thereafter, we had Catholic missionaries arriving. Just 3 years later, that was all it took to fill the void in their spiritual lives. Economically, the void was filled by the encomienda system. There we go. And so the Aztecs basically were forced to work as slaves on Spanish-owned farms. Now, not everyone agreed with this. Not everyone thought this was a good idea. And Charles V, the Emperor of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, or Chucky V as I called him back in high school, he tried to ban this. But this was in the age before email, before even the telephone, if you can believe it. It was very hard to communicate. It was very hard to enforce orders from across an ocean. And so the system wasn't really banned in practice. The Aztecs also, though, they turned out to be poor workers. Not necessarily that they were lazy, but that they tended to die very quickly with the hard labor on these farms. So a great, enormous tragedy, using up the human life for a very miserable little profit. And so, if you were a Spanish colonist, it wasn't like things were the greatest in New Spain anyway. New Spain is the name that they gave what we today call Mexico. The Spanish government hoarded 20% of all wealth that was produced from the area. They didn't want to give back, they didn't want to develop the area, they just wanted to take as much as they could, especially when it came to gold, silver, and cash crops, like especially something like sugar, which was very commonly grown more so in the Caribbean. And they were also looking to populate the areas. They wanted to have lots of babies to fill up the population, to make it more European. They brought in a marriage law, meaning that the Spanish soldiers that were stationed there in New Spain had to either bring their European wives or marry local Mexican native girls. Basically, it was a baby making operation. So we see in the top right, this is a picture of what one of these encomienda looked like. So kind of barren and sparse, a big building to collect the crops, an overseer raining down death upon slaves who didn't work hard enough. We see here, these were the treasure ships, the legendary Spanish treasure fleet that would travel usually several times a year across to Spain. They were often the targets of pirates. If you could get even one of these treasure galleons, you'd be loaded for life, at least until you blew your fortune on drinking and partying. So this mini unit has very much been a story. It's been a story. And so what's the point of knowing the story? Well, this is what it all boils down to. This is how the worldview of both the Spanish and the natives in Mexico would change as a result of all this. So the Aztecs, having given up their old gods, embraced Catholicism. You might think they would hate it. It just conquered them. But they figured it must be the superior religion because it defeated our gods. Spain, for a while, for a good century or so, became Europe's most powerful country. You'll remember they were very poor and bankrupt, but with all of this gold and treasure that was coming in from their colonies in the Americas, they had a ton of money, but it was mostly spent on more wars and on big palaces. The commoners actually didn't reap the benefits or see any real improvement to their quality of life from all this money that was coming in. They just continued being poor farmers and shopkeepers. This was also the birth of a brand new people, the mestizo, who were a mix of the European and the natives. We also saw a decline, though, of the indigenous people. As they became more and more of a minority, they were given the worst treatment of anyone at all. You know, it was believed that the first mestizo baby in Mexico was the child, the son of La Malinche and Hernan Cortes. You might wonder, did they live happily ever after? No. No, he abandoned her and the child as well. So it's a real tragic story there. Their love was not meant to last. It was an affair of passion and convenience. Now, this division of wealth in Mexico continues. Oh, that always scares me, that religious church singing. I hate being interrupted like that. Oh no. What an affront to my dignity, being interrupted twice by the music of my own PowerPoint. But what was also an affront to the dignity was that to the dignity of the indigenous and mestizo people in Mexico. To this day, the divisions of wealth that began in the Spanish colonial period persist. Those who are purely indigenous are the poorest today in Mexican society. The mestizo are somewhat wealthier, the mestizo people. Those who are of strictly European descent, they tend to be the wealthiest. So we see here a depiction there in the bottom right of a European and indigenous marriage with their child. Happy little baby there. Okay, so that's the key part for our worldview. Really, the impact and the mix of the Spanish and the Aztec and indigenous cultures. But you're probably wondering what happened to our hero, you could call him, hero in quotation marks, Hernan Cortes. So at first, as you can imagine, he was honored. He brought enormous gold and excitement and adventure to Spain. However, he was a little bit power hungry. His dream was to become basically a second Spanish emperor on the other side of the ocean. Charles V was really not very trusting of him, so he appointed 4 royal officials to limit Cortez's power. There were a series of scandals swirling around Cortes. Some said he had actually murdered a man, and by that we mean one of his fellow Spaniards, because Lord knows he murdered a lot of Aztecs. But he was never found guilty, so he never had to go to jail like Christopher Columbus did, or was sent home in shackles. And he warned you, like your mother had, that all that he could give you was a reputation. And so he ended up dying in Spain. He went back over across to Europe. He was wealthy, but he died a bitter, angry man because he lost the power he had once had over the new colonies of New Spain, and his reputation was tarnished by these allegations of scandal. He was no longer the hero that he once was. So, serves him right, really. So for our activity, I want you to think about the injustices that were inflicted upon the Aztecs and the other indigenous people in New Spain. They were documented, actually, by Father Bartolome de las Casas. And so he was one of these missionaries who was sent over to help convert the natives, and he was shocked by the abuses that he witnessed there. He wrote this in a book and notified the Europeans, people back home, of what was happening. So I want you to examine and document some of your challenges you've had with other human beings. Make sure you're anonymous about who they are, that you've had in junior high. Document the injustices you've witnessed, maybe personally, or maybe you've seen other people go through, in your own form of Aztec codex. So we see the Aztecs also, those who survived, documented some of these injustices inflicted upon them. Try to include at least 4 scenes. So that's been our look at the fall of the Aztec Empire. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully you can wipe away the tears that you've surely shed at the destruction of this civilization. Until later, farewell.